Throughout my life, I have seen multiple generations debate on which time period was the best to live in. There's no doubt that what we experience firsthand has a bearing on those thoughts. But for me, the 1980s and before just seem different. There are numerous things that we once did on a daily basis but will never be done again. In this video, we will discuss some things that we did in the 80s but can no longer do. Telephones are something that has definitely gone through a lot of changes over the last couple decades. Most people now have cell phones, but if you are still using a landline, then chances are it is not a rotary phone. It's probably push button, and it may even be cordless. Do you remember having to untangle the phone cord? No matter how careful you were, it was going to end up tangled at some point. These older phones also required us to dial a number from memory unless we had a little address book or phone book. Today, cell phones have pretty well replaced both of those. But that's not the only thing that cell phones have replaced. There was a time when we had to pay for long-distance calls. Televisions are another item that has seen its share of changes over the years. Before we got things like cable, we all had rabbit ears. And yes, maybe you still have some modern rabbit ears, but I doubt you have foil on them or some big antenna on top of the roof. But when was the last time that you had to connect an RF modulator between your VCR and television? If you were into vintage items, then maybe you have, but really it's gone. Something else that we used to do with all the big boxy televisions was slap the sides or top to get better reception. I don't know why it worked, but it did. Today we see smoking areas outside of businesses, but in the early 80s and before you could smoke anywhere. Any restaurant or grocery store was completely fine. Even commercial airplanes allowed it, and they had little ashtrays in the armrest. Back then, even the captain would smoke in the cockpit and we were perfectly fine with it. We never wanted him to get a headache or the shakes from not getting his nicotine fix 30,000 feet in the air. Something even as simple as milk has changed. If we had soy milk, almond milk, or whatever else milk, then it certainly was not where I was. But half-gallon milk came in cartons rather than jugs, and do you remember what was on the side of those cartons? They were the Have You Seen Me photos and information about people that were missing. It's almost hard to believe now, but there were a lot of full-service stations in addition to self-service. Most of those full-service gas stations have disappeared, but something else that has disappeared is the leaded gasoline that we used to buy. Back then, fuel was a whole lot cheaper than what it is now, and you could fill up a muscle car for less than $10. One thing that we were all glad to see go was the 55 miles per hour national speed limit that we could see on highways and interstates. It took forever to get anywhere at that speed. The 80s was a time period when kids looked forward to each and every Saturday morning so they could watch their cartoons. People looked in the TV guide to see what was on television and when to make sure that they could be home for it. Not everyone had a VCR in the earlier part of the decade, so occasionally we would be so busy that we would forget to tune into our show and we would miss it. The majority of households still got the newspaper delivered every day of the week. There was nothing better than going through the Sunday paper and looking at all the sales ads, comics, and coupons. Back then, kids loved getting a side job as a paperboy or paper girl. Now all of that seems to be mostly gone. In the 80s, tons of kids dreamed of one day going up into space on the space shuttle. We all believed that that would one day be possible, and even more so when the first teacher was going up into space. But when the Challenger disaster happened, our opinions changed a little bit, and now the space shuttle is gone forever, so it sure won't happen. Parents in the 70s and early 80s had chickenpox parties with their children. Don't think of parties with birthday hats or fun games. It wasn't exactly like that. Usually, kids would just go to visit the kid that had it, and then parents would introduce you to it by touch. If you did not go, then your parents might, and then bring it home and have contact with you. That was still a chickenpox party. It's not exactly exciting, but it did get it out of the way when it was convenient rather than at Christmas or some other important event. Being bored as a kid in the early 80s or before was just part of everyday life. We went shopping with our parents at stores, and we didn't have cell phones to entertain us. Nobody's kids looked crazy in the stores doing the latest TikTok dances. We waited at dentist and doctor's offices with our moms, and most of the time we were stuck listening to some sort of elevator music. If we were lucky, then maybe they had the Highlights magazine, but you could bet that some kid had already solved all the puzzles inside. In the 80s, we were all about being clean and smelling good. The old school vacuums that were used had one of those bags that would fill up with air, gave off a whiff of old dust, and then got really warm when it was used. To combat the dusty smell, we would sprinkle Carpet Fresh on the carpet so it would emit a pleasant smell through the vacuum. Occasionally, the vacuum bag would bust, and what a mess that was. Potpourri pots or warmers could be found in just about every home. They smelled good, but they sort of made a sticky, gummy mess in the pot. Incense was another way of getting your house to smell better than cigarette smoke. But one of the craziest things that ladies had in their homes were the decorative soaps in the bathrooms. You know, the kinds that look like little flowers, shells, or balls in a bowl? They came in all sorts of colors and scents, but they did have one important rule. Do not use them. They were for decoration only. Some of the things that you could find in living rooms of the 80s could be pretty interesting. For starters, just about everyone had the old wooden console televisions that weighed as much as a naval destroyer. Metal TV trays were essential to have so that you could eat dinner and watch your favorite television show. Some households stored them under the couch or in a coat closet, while others had an actual storage rack in the living room. If you were really fancy, then you probably ordered the clapper off of a television commercial. Those became the source of many jokes, but secretly we all wanted one. Another essential item that was found in many living rooms was anything made out of brass. What you may not have realized is that it took a lot of polishing to keep it looking good. Ceramic animals and figurines were also popular to have in living rooms. These came painted, but many people purchased them in blank white and then tried their hand at painting it themselves. And once it was done, there was no better place to show off your artwork than the living room. The 80s had a lot of things that spoiled us, and we didn't even realize it. Hostess ding-dongs came in foil, and for some reason they just seemed to taste better. Showbiz Pizza had some fun for the whole family, and to a kid there was no better currency than some of the gold coins or tickets to get some prizes. But the decade wasn't without its share of scams. Remember the erasable pens? The only way it seemed like you could erase the ink is if you finally wore a hole in the paper. Thousands of women fell for the epilating. Sure, it got rid of your leg hair, but not without some real pain after it ripped out the hair and made it ingrown. During cartoons, they would air commercials that lured kids into calling 1-800 numbers so they could speak with their favorite cartoon characters. These commercials always had a warning saying to get your parents' permission, but virtually no kid ever did. That was always a nice surprise for the parents when they saw how much they were being charged for some call that they did not even make. Despite all of the scams in the decade, the 80s was a great one to experience. The positives far outweighed all of the negatives. The 1980s had a lot of style, and most of it is long gone. However, it's interesting when we see some of it come back. The mullets are certainly something that has, but ladies, where's that big hair? What are some of the things that you loved about the 80s? Let us know in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching.